Hi, we're about to start at 5 o'clock, so thanks for joining. We're just getting set up and getting our guest speaker. Stephen, thanks for joining. We've got a great crowd. So I'm reminding everyone who's on, if you haven't signed the petition, please remember to go over to repaircampaign.org/sign and stand in solidarity as we are raising consciousness and numbers to help our petition for reparations. I'm Sharon Roper. I'm one of the advocates for the Repair Campaign. The Repair Campaign, as you know, we have launched a week of repair. So from today through to the 25th of March, we should be commemorating and recognizing our ancestors who were enslaved, trafficked, and brutalized under the system that they call the transatlantic slave trade. So today is the 60th anniversary of the United Nations International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And it's apt that we start with this day. On the 25th of March, as you know, is the United Nations Day for the record to recognize the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. So it starts there. And the context for looking at the whole issue of race and separating a man by his skin color is something that, when we look at the history, really was codified during this period of time. And to join me on this conversation today is, we're very honored to have Stephen Golden, president of the Jamaica chapter of the UNIA. Is it just the Jamaica? Have we gone broader than that now, Stephen?
No, still just Jamaica.
Still Jamaica.
Division 1, the first division. The Alpha, you know.
At the beginning. So we're very excited about the conversation. We also have, and I know it's not going to be for long, but we have Empress Golding, who is a real advocate as well around young people. And the Repair Campaign is very focused on bringing our young people up along that curve. I mentioned when I first started, I need to shout out to the 24 schools who have just finished Heat 1 of an international reparations debate competition. So it's schools across the Caribbean, and we have schools from the UK who debated the pros and cons of reparations. If you missed Heat 1, it's all of the heats have been saved on the Center for Reparations Research YouTube page. And you'll see all the heats that took place this week. So, and look out for the round of 16. So that's good. So enlightening conversation. So I may even touch upon some of those conversations today. But I want to kick off the conversation, Stephen, because we know, and research has shown that Britain, who at the time of the start of the transatlantic slave trade, slavery was outlawed on the land in the UK. However, they codified the system of brutality with what we now know as the 1661 Barbados Slave Code. So it's originated in Barbados, and it was a slave code that basically legally allowed the brutality without recourse. So the behavior of working people to death, raping, brutalizing, were all criminal activities in the UK. But they developed this code that allowed the plantation owners to get away with this. Yeah. And really, when you look at the spread of that across the colonies and the way they use that slave code, you can see how before then, and this is what was so kind of horrifying, before then, nations were nations. And when you read the Bible, you don't know who is black and who is white in the Bible, but it's full of nations that come from Africa. So before then, history doesn't distinguish a man's color of his skin to distinguish who he's from or where he was. The slave trade system codified the difference between black and white and codified the power structure there. What's your take on that history and how that is the roots of what we're looking at today, the everyday racism that we're seeing?
Yeah, the codification you're speaking about, you're very right in terms of legislation that institutionalized racism, particularly in the West. That was one of the earliest. But, you know, different colonies had different legislations. In Jamaica, for example, there was an issue at one point in terms of dealing with Africans who were free during the period of slavery. because a lot of times we forget that that is a part of the narrative also. You know, there was a particular law made, and I'm giving this as an example, in Jamaica in 1723, 1724, under Governor Aldane. At the time, it had to do with the first black man who attended Cambridge University. I don't know how many of our listeners and viewers know that the first black man to attend Cambridge University did so in the mid early 1700s, in about the 1710s, 1720s, and that he was from Jamaica, right? A very famous poet named Francis Williams. In fact, I often tell teachers that it's a shame that enough Jamaicans still don't recognize this man, because he was probably the first black teacher on the island who set up a school in Spanish Town to teach, to educate the children of free Africans here at the time, and even some who weren't free, which he had to do undercover. But there was a law made in 1724 when, you know, a white man assaulted him and called him a black dog. And he responded to the man calling him a white dog, who the man then proceeded to put his hands on him. And Williams defended himself. And promptly after that, the Jamaican Assembly passed a law in 1724 making it illegal for a black man, free or not, to strike a white man, even in self-defense. Right? Now, these are some apartheid laws that we often don't recall when we speak about our history, but I give it to you as an example that, you know, Sharon, you're absolutely right in terms of codifying racism, codifying what would later be known in South Africa as apartheid, you know, was a step-by-step process which came out of the transatlantic slave trade. And
Oh, wow. Yeah. We lost a
you know,
seconds. Yeah.
I also have to mention the fact that, you know, first let me congratulate the Repair campaign for this initiative. I think that this should be done annually, March 21st to 25th, nestled in between two international days declared by the UN, one being the Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which began in 1966, and the other being the International Day of Remembrance for the transatlantic victims of the transatlantic slave trade. Today, March 21st, actually is the 65th anniversary. This day was chosen by the UN because of how shocking that incident was in, you know, on the world stage in terms of awakening people's sensibilities about the horrific consequences of institutionalizing racism and of oppressing people. I don't know how many of our young people today remember the Sharpeville massacre. It happened before I was born, but certainly in my era when the anti-apartheid was still very vocal. The Sharpeville massacre on March 21st was something that was always recognized. It was an incident in which, you know, over 100 South Africans were shot down by the police. Over 200 were wounded. Among the dead were children, simply because they chose to march on police stations and offer themselves to be arrested because they refused to accept the apartheid passbook system. Now, this was a system that even Marcus Garvey went to the League of Nations about as early as the 1920s. You know, it was the codification in South Africa of laws restricting Black people to only live in certain areas. You know, they couldn't, you know, it was like Jim Crow in America. Separate dining, you couldn't eat here, you couldn't stay here. All of this, again, examples of governments legislating and instituting racism, codifying it into the laws of the country and teaching it to generations as if this is an accepted norm. You know what I mean? And this is how we are to treat with African people. So I think it's fitting that we not only recognize that 65th anniversary of Sharpeville, but this be the beginning of something we do annually, you know, because as Black people, I don't know any African country that has chosen a date, even before these international days were declared by the UN, where we pause for a second and recognize the sacrifices of our ancestors. You know, Marcus Garvey said in 1920 that August 31st should be declared a holiday for the race. That was something similar, but it took us 101 years to even get the UN to declare that, and they only did that in 2021. Other than that, there's been no date that we've chosen. You know what I mean? Jewish people have their Passover. They never forget the brutalities of Egypt. Every year in November, the first world nations, you know, recognize their fallen soldiers in World War I and World War II. But Africa itself fought a war against slavery. Africans themselves fought a war against slavery on the slave ships and in the colonies. You know, 1522, just 3 years ago, December, marked the 500-year anniversary of the first recorded uprising by enslaved Africans, which took place in the Dominican Republic on the plantation of the nephew of Christopher Columbus, Don Diego Colon. It went by without anybody uttering a word, because, you know, for a long time the system didn't want to teach us the truth of our history, whether they were ashamed, whether they were afraid of the consequences of people knowing the truth of the brutality that our ancestors faced. It was suppressed till we as a people have picked it up. We celebrate everybody else's holiday, Christmas, Easter, even Passover, right? But we have never taken a day to say, listen, we need to pay homage to those who laid down their life so that we could live the way we live today. Right? Still not mentally free, but certainly a long way from 1724 when it was illegal for a black man to defend himself against a white man, right here in Jamaica, right? Don't forget that name, the famous poet Francis Williams, and that is on the law books in Jamaica. When was that law changed? I'm not even sure, because we don't even celebrate that too. I suspect it may not have been changed until the great black barrister Jack Smith came to Parliament, or maybe when Jordan and Osborne, who were some of the first colored half black, half white men to enter the Jamaican Assembly in the mid 1800s, maybe just about 10 years before the abolition of slavery. Maybe they changed that law. But the fact is, we have a history here in Jamaica and in Barbados and in other countries of legislators instituting laws based strictly on race and designed primarily to suppress, to oppress black people, and in particular to stifle their ability to create wealth. That's another big point we should not forget, right?
Yeah, no, and that's, I mean, I don't want to move off this because there's actually quite a few questions I have there, but we don't understand when we say codified in the system, that whole creation of black wealth. And I repeat this to as many people as want to hear this. So William Pitt, the UK Prime Minister, who said not even a nailhead should be made in the colonies. And that defined the system under which the Caribbean has lived and still lives with subsequent own governments. We still are slow to look at value add and wealth creation because that was the system.
Yes.
So really,
Yes.
I don't, and it was sad, the debates that I was talking about, it was sad and good because there was some great, but there was also children there who, like you said, have been educated to want to just forget the history. So it saddens me every time I hear someone say, why talk about it? Why talk about the past? Why talk about, and there's no thought of celebrating and recognizing the resistance that happened, like you said, from the time before they got on the boat, as they stepped into the land in the Caribbean, and continually until we got the abolition. So we have to give credit to them until we got abolition.
Yeah, man, remember, you know, there were treaties signed with a number of African kingdoms that were established. You know, you spoke about, you know, the codification of racist legislation and pointing to the 1600s in Barbados. But let's not forget that chattel slavery was first commercialized in the Congo Empire in Africa in the early 1500s. Right? And when I say chattel slavery was commercialized, we also have to understand that there's a major difference between slavery, which has existed for centuries before the transatlantic slave trade, and chattel slavery, which really was a creation by the Europeans to feed this market, to extract free labor, and to dehumanize the Africans, right? slavery before that never dehumanized the person. Chattel slavery, Africans didn't will their slaves in perpetuity to their generations. Africans didn't impregnate enslaved women and then enslave their own children. So there are some serious things that went wrong when it comes to chattel slavery. And it's the reason why even at the UN level, we are working hard for that distinction to be made. You know, a broad brush saying slavery is a crime against humanity doesn't quite do it, because slavery is still even happening till today. If you look at the issue of human trafficking and what some people have to go through to enter certain countries with the assistance of others who they then have to repay, sometimes in indentured service, right? These deals are still being made right now. But really what should be pointedly stated as a crime against humanity is chattel slavery. That slavery that says you are no longer a human being, you are simply property and nothing beyond that. And therefore we can go to parliament and people will vote to say, well, it's wrong for any black man to strike a white man because he's not human. That's what happened here in 1724. If you were recognizing the humanity of these Africans, no well-thinking legislator would say, well, how are we going to make a law that says a man can't defend himself? First, they have to believe that he's not a man. You know, he is less than a man. And these things affected multiple generations. So when we talk about a day for the elimination of racial discrimination, people have to understand that racial discrimination didn't happen overnight. It was a process that went hand in hand with the commercialization of chattel slavery, and then with the codification of laws to hold that system in place to protect it, right, and to expand it. Then out of that came the institution of racism. Because let's be honest, Europe was familiar with Africa long before they went in there and began engaging in chattel slavery. You know, the Portuguese built castles in Ethiopia in the 15th century before Columbus even came across the Atlantic, right? Mansa Musa took a hajj from West Africa to Mecca, spent so much gold that Europeans after that came in droves to Africa searching for the fabled Prester John and this kingdom of gold, simply because Mansa Musa people had never seen gold, one person with so much gold before. And that is really what caused the onset of the European exploration into Africa. They came to Africa looking for gold. What they found was a slavery system that they were able to tweak, to manipulate to their advantage, and then exploit out of sight of the Africans. Because remember that the Africans who probably operated slave markets in Africa had no idea what chattel slavery looked like. In fact, in the case of Jamaica, this is such a good example. One of the people who we've been saying should be a national hero, Chief Tachi, or Jamaicans say Chief Taki, right? But the Ghanaian pronunciation is Tachi. Chief Tachi was a slave trader in what we know today as Ghana, which was then called the Gold Coast. And he was a slave trader who was tricked by the enslavers he was selling Africans to, put on a slave ship, put into chattel slavery himself. And when he got here and began to understand this system, that it was so different than what he thought he was selling people into, he immediately revolted and led probably the wickedest. And when I say wickedest, I mean in the Jamaican sense, the baddest, you know, the best resistance, right? The best uprising, well organized, done at Easter time, well coordinated across the island. And people have to remember that this happened 30 years before the Haitian Revolution. In fact, when people say that Dutty Bookman was a Jamaican who started the Haitian Revolution, Dutty Bookman could have been an escaped African who had survived the Tachi uprising and carried the same idea to Haiti. So, you know, it walks hand in hand. And I'm not just trying to boast about Jamaica, because Africans resisted slavery everywhere. When I learned history in Jamaica, they did not teach me that Maroons existed outside of Jamaica. Right? The first Maroons didn't even exist in Jamaica. Remember I said 1522 was the first recorded uprising by Africans? Well, those Africans burnt Columbus's nephew's plantation to the ground, and they weren't killed. They took off to the hills and they were never enslaved again. That means they effectively became maroons in that country, right? And this is only 26, 27 years after Columbus discovered Jamaica. So what I'm trying to show you is that from the very beginning, from the first set of Africans were brought here as chattel, they rejected the system. They burnt plantations. And this also led to Europe now violating the slave trade agreements with the Africans. In the 1526, 4 years after that uprising in the Dom Rep, there is a letter that is recorded. People can Google this, written from the Mani Congo of the Congo Empire. That means the emperor, the king of kings of the Congo Empire, written to the king of Portugal, right, Alfonso I. And that letter states, send no more slave traders. Your traders are violating the agreement. They are no longer purchasing slaves from the what you call it, the authorized slave markets, and that they are now kidnapping even women and children. That letter from the king says that even some of his own relatives have disappeared, and it instructs the king of Portugal to do two things. One, find his people in Brazil where he believed they were sent, and repatriate them, and secondly, to send no more slave traders. So from 1526, here's a prominent African king saying, this thing, the way you're doing this thing, it's got to stop. We don't want it anymore. But of course, by then, it had become addictive like a narcotic to Europe. And so what they then went on to do now is to use their guns and their arms and their liquor and to pit one tribe against the other. Remember, Africa was at a stage then where it had not centralized yet. So you had small kingdoms, you know, for example, like the Zulus, you had kingdoms like the Amhara or the Tigranians in Ethiopia, who were expanding, and they were conquering smaller kingdoms and consolidating their countries. So it was a prime time for Europe to pit tribe against tribe. Oh, these guys are invading you. They're taking over your land. We'll give you some guns to fight them. All you have to promise us is that everybody you capture or whatever, help us, capture these people and enslave them, right? And I have to keep repeating this because too often I hear our own people talking about, oh, we sold each other and we did this and we did that. And it really comes from a basis of lack of understanding of the history and the intricacies of the history that was involved at the time. You know what I mean? Things were never that as simple. People have to remember, you know, that this concept of Africa, one Africa, even Pan-Africanism, it was not born on the continent of Africa. It was a direct product in resistance to chattel enslavement. It was the Africans who were brought on those boats, mixed up tribes put together, who realized that, listen, whatever our differences were in the past, I might have fought you, we might have had some feud, but right now, this crap that we're in requires us to work together. So it doesn't matter if we're Ashanti or Zulu or we're Fulani or we're Amhara. Right now, we're just Africans. So we got to be together. And that was the birth of Pan-Africanism, you know? Incidentally, this year in July will be the 125th, the quasi-quicentennial, is that the word? Yes, the quasi-quicentennial, the 125th anniversary of the first Pan-African Conference, the first time that word was used publicly as part of a major conference, which took place in London in 1900. And funnily enough, that conference was spearheaded not by continental Africans, but by quote-unquote West Indians, Africans in the diaspora, people like Henry Sylvester Williams from Trinidad, people like James Christian from Dominica, the W.E.B. Du Bois from America. These were the people who came together, Benito Sylvain from Haiti, who came together in London to say, listen, our approach to the issue that Black people are facing around the world needs to be a united effort, because it doesn't matter if we're in America or in Jamaica or in London, we're facing discrimination. which again came as a result of the codification
Codification.
of those laws. So, I don't know if people know this, but, slavery was never legal in London, right?
Yes, well, they outlawed it. They outlawed slavery in the early second century. So it was actually on their
Yes,
books that it was
yes.
illegal. And why the British colonies, when a plantation owner would bring back his trusted servant or the woman that he's decided that is his wife now, because they were humans at the end of the day, because there's some people that were humans, they couldn't be slaves in the UK. So
No,
they were
no.
not legally allowed to be slaves in the UK. But then the system did. I can't remember his name now, Steve. You remember his name, but you had to take them to
This,
court. You had
yes,
to go to
that
court.
was John Stewart, the
John
famous
Stewart,
Somerset case,
Somerset
right?
case. Yes.
Yes, John Stewart's African name was actually Kwabena Kogwano,
Mm-hmm.
right? In fact, he was one of the first Africans to write a book having experienced chattel slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote that book in the late 1700s. This is before Equiano's book. And it is one of the first books that even talks about reparation. So this thing of reparation goes back some 300 plus years. That even the people who had lived through chattel slavery, had survived it and had gained their freedom, were saying that certain things need to be done to balance out the
Right.
damage, that such
Mm-hmm.
damage was done that reparations was absolutely necessary. And it's so funny you mentioned that case, because there's also a thing that in London, they would claim them as their servants, right? Treat them a little better, dress them a little better. I mean, you couldn't see a man whipping his slave in the streets of London, because, as you said, it was illegal. And one, it was illegal because the British themselves had been enslaved
Slave,
by the
right?
Romans.
Yes. Well,
And so in founding their society,
mm-hmm.
they knew the ills of that. So that law was made because of their
Only
own
experience.
experience of laws being codified under the Romans
Mm-hmm.
that enslaved them,
Right.
right? And the next thing is that the papal bulls played a role in this too,
Mm-hmm. Oh.
because remember, before the commercialization of chattel slavery, the Portuguese and later the Spanish were empowered by the Pope. There was a papal bull that sort of, gave them the right that anybody who wasn't a Christian, they were allowed to go forth and Christianize them and civilize them. And a lot of the issues that Africa faced at the hands of European enslavers was justified by that
Right.
papal bull.
That
And
people bought.
that's why by the time you had some black people being brought to London, though they had been enslaved in the Caribbean and now were being called servants. In the case of even John Stewart, you know what they would do? They would find a church, because the papal bull spoke to, you can do this to people who are not Christians.
Mm-hmm.
These enslaved Africans would then get baptized in the church and say, look, see, I'm a Christian now. You can't enslave me, right? So I'm just showing you the craftiness of our ancestors, and don't feel like they didn't understand legislation and codification, and don't feel like they didn't have a hand in fighting those things too. I just mentioned Kwabena Kogwano or John Stewart.
Mm-hmm.
But John Stewart was a part of a group in the late 1700s known as the Sons of Africa, right? 12 formerly enslaved Africans. I believe 2 of them had been brought from Jamaica. One was connected to the Duke of Manchester, for which one of our parishes is named, right? And his name was Mandeville, right? Because that was the name of his owner. These 12 men happened to be in London in the 1770s, 1780s. They worked for very powerful British men, some of them connected to parliamentarians, even Pitt, the prime minister, others, right? Wilberforce and so forth. It was these men who would meet and strategize over the different legal approaches to fighting the system. That's how John Stewart ended up getting baptized. They said, like what they were saying, well, let's try this. If their book says Christians can't be this, let's go get baptized. Okay, that doesn't work. So what these men actually ended up doing was bringing the case of the Zong. For those who don't know, the Zong was a slave ship that was overloaded from Ghana, lost its way coming to Jamaica, figured that they wouldn't have enough water to survive the course correction because they were carrying too many people, and decided to throw the weaker, sicker, enslaved Africans overboard. The reason they had to throw them overboard is because of a clause in the insurance that said, well, if they die from these circumstances, we'll pay for them. But if they die because of your neglect and you not handling them properly, then we won't pay for them. So they decide, because you had Africans who jumped overboard. So they decided to make it look like, they jumped overboard and therefore collect the insurance. Well, it was Equiano who had heard the narrative from one of the Africans who survived that ordeal. Because can I tell you this? It's about 130 something were thrown overboard. Yes. And of the 130 something that were thrown overboard, one of them climbed back on board. Have you ever seen a 18th century wooden ship? I mean, right, listen, they've made movies about people falling off of their yacht and not being able to get back on board if nobody's there to help you. Well, one of them climbed, that's fingernail. That is like adrenaline. Climbed back up the ship. So he survived the experience, came to Jamaica, was able to relate the story. The story comes back to the Sons of Africa, which is why I'm telling you, I'm sure one of them were Jamaican, because Equiano was not in Jamaica at the time that it happened, but somehow he got the story. And he brought the story to the attention of Wilberforce and Granville Sharp, who were young MPs at the time, looking for a case to make a name and make a political career for themselves. And so they spoke out about this insurance fraud, and Equiano continued to plug them with information, wrote his book, shared it with them, converted them to being abolitionists. And they eventually were the legislators who legislated the end of the slave trade, not the end of slavery, but they ended the slave trade in 1807. And this would have been about 15 years after Equiano dies. But a lot of people don't understand that while we talk about Wilberforce, Granville Sharp, and all these people, if there was no Oluwado Equiano, those men would have never heard about the Zong, and slavery might have gone on for maybe another 50 years. Wouldn't have gone on forever, because remember, it wasn't just the fight in terms of legislation that was putting them under pressure. We had Tachi in 1760. We had Haiti in 1791. You had a number of uprisings which was indicating to the enslavers that the system couldn't hold. They had exploited the labor so much that they had overpopulated these islands. And sooner or later, these Africans were going to wake up and say, look, 1,000 white men can't keep 100,000 black people down, right? Which is what happened in Haiti. And it was very successful, to say the least.
Was the first, yeah. And we must add, because the layer that drives a lot of this is money, though, Steve. So one of the other reasons why it was a perfect storm was industrialization was beginning to take off in Europe, and they were beginning to make money by other means, and the headache and the effort to contain the uprising and generate that revenue was becoming less attractive. So I was in England when I was taught the history of Wilberforce and the White Knight that came and saved us.
But it was the wealth that they extracted
that built the Industrial Revolution.
Fueled the Industrial Revolution.
100%. So, and a lot of the talent as well, the ideas, the innovation, the talent were just extracted. So they didn't just extract us from our history and our ancestors and our people and our tongue and our language. They extracted our ideas and inventions and brought that and then turned that into revenue, turned that into fund that actually then built the Industrial Revolution and left us empty at the end of colonial stage. because colonialism is just another word for slavery. They just kind of moved it and gave it a
Yes.
new name. But still,
Yeah.
we didn't benefit. So that is, we're coming really forward with this, because one of the things that I like to focus on heavily is the so what here now, because we have started a petition, and it really is about just finding out if we can get, because there's a story that the abolitionist movement in the UK, they got 100,000 signatures apparently in the UK to support Wilberforce to take it into Parliament, and this was done by the people that supported the abolitionists. So one day at the Repair campaign, I said, well, let's get 100,000 signatures to say we're going to take back to the UK, to say, listen, enough is enough now. You left us bare. You gave us debt as a way of us building our country, as opposed to paying back the stolen goods. It's time that we sit down and have a real negotiation about how we repair the damage, because it's hurting both economies. We're not growing. We had nothing to start with. And despite having nothing when the end of we got our independence, this is across the Caribbean, what the Caribbean has built up shows some of the strength and tenacity of our ancestors. Because we built from nothing. We had no road. It was nothing, empty. We was given debt to try and invest, rather than the wealth that they extracted that they were investing in their colonies. And we had to overcome
Yeah.
debt to grow an economy. And yet we're still making headways. But there is this thing when they
And
fight
the slap in the face was the payment to the
to the enslaved.
enslavers
That
that
was a
that
slap.
that our descendants then still had to be paying back. And to me, that's the biggest indication that slavery didn't end out of no enlightenment or no realization on their part or recognition of our humanity. It is like you said, the system wasn't tenable. And even in shutting the system down, they made sure to squeeze that last bit of money out of it. Like, okay, if we're going to give them their freedom, you got to pay us for it. And the same thing was done in Haiti. I mean, Haiti was made to pay the debt of the value of the Africans on the island at the time of the Haitian Revolution. Otherwise, the world was going to ignore them. There could be no trade. There would be no markets for them. France and America colluded in that. Britain to an extent too, even though Britain, and many people don't know this, funded black ops covertly, supporting the Haitians in the Haitian Revolution. And how do I know this? Because the person that they sent to carry out those operations was a Jamaican, half black, half white. His name was John Perkins. He was the first black man to be brought into the British Navy. And in 1792, the British admiral here in Jamaica sent a man of war to secure his release from a French prison in Haiti, because he had been captured selling guns to Dessalines by the French. And let me tell you something. The British was involved. They sent a man of war to free a single black man. Yeah. So they were probably afraid of whatever testimony he would give, that Britain, because Britain and France were at war at the time or whatever, or had some treaty where Britain should not have involved themselves. But they did for whatever reason. Maybe they thought they would be able to capture Haiti themselves later. But so much of this history is lost because we don't repeat it and we don't teach it. Yet instead we continue to propagate this British narrative, which really only glorifies them and leaves out such substantial parts of the story that completely change the narrative once you're aware of it, And
that is, so we're going to talk about, so this is the first of 5 conversations we're going to have between now and the 25th. And then we're going to have a discussion around education with the UK curriculum movement on Tuesday, Brian there. But education is such a big part of this. And one of the challenges that we're facing at the Repair campaign is, how do we agitate to get the history books rewritten? So having got our independence, and we had CARICOM now, we have CXC, and we're now responsible for writing history books. How do we then write our own truth?
We don't even need to get them written, Sharon. There are books that have been written, and this is a good time for me to plug the #1 Jamaican historian, anthropologist, first black war correspondent, the man who was at Haile Selassie's coronation, which is the reason why Rastas over here even knew about it. And his name was Joel Augustus Rogers, born in Negril, very light-skinned black man, but who went to America and was treated, discriminated against because he was obviously black, despite his light skin color. They couldn't miss the afro when he was young, and decided that he was going to spend his entire life researching the history of Africans to show that we had a worthy and admirable history long before slavery. And in doing so, he uncovered some incredibly amazing and unknown things. He even traced the African bloodline in the British royalty and the other European royalties. This is a man who wrote about people like Gannibal, who was an African who was gifted to Peter the Great, the Tsar of Russia, and who became a famous black engineer and military man in Russia. Our Jamaican historian wrote about these things. He was a contemporary of Marcus Garvey, but he had to self-publish his books. And his books have never been incorporated in the Jamaican educational system, because in the early days, there's always some Rasta book that. Remember Jamaica in the 70s and 60s during the Black Power era went so crazy that they even banned the Black Beauty, right? Yeah. Because they thought it was a black empowering book because it was called Black Beauty and it was about a horse, right? So we don't need to rewrite it. What we need to do is resurrect these, reprint them, and put them in their rightful place in the schools. I got to plug in my
and we do. And actually, on the, and I'm going to do a plug for the Repair campaign. So on the Repair campaign website, it has a library, and if Joel is not there, he will be. I think so. Brian is online, so just ping to say if he's there. But it actually is. It's a platform for everything reparation. So we're pulling together the different stories. There's links to movies, stories, books, videos, talks by the different historians around Black history. That was all there. It's like a library online for people that want to go find out the history. Because one of the things that we need to do to eliminate, because eliminating racial discrimination starts with us also understanding that we're not less than. So as a young child growing up, the hardest job of a parent, and I had my first son in the UK, the hardest job of the parent is instilling in that child that you are really great, you are part of the system and you're part of the world. And it sounds really trite, but that you existed from the very beginning and you are not less than. Just that small consciousness seed. And it's less of an issue in the Caribbean because they're surrounded by Black people that they can see, the Africans that they can see and recognize. They're Caribbeans, Jamaicans, Grenadians, and they look like me and they're doctors, lawyers. But really, when you look in the world stage, there is so much negativism about being Black. So part of that is actually instilling in them from a child the history of who you are and where you sit in history as well.
Yes, and one of the first things we got to do to accomplish that is throw away these European nursery rhymes, right? And in fact, we got a new book out called Daddy Marcus Nursery Rhymes that we're going to share with the people soon. So forget Mother Goose. Mother Goose was people.
Oh.
You know, yeah. And a lot of those nursery rhymes were written during the time of the enslavement of African people. London Bridge was written when London Bridge was being built. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You know, and Humpty Dumpty, Baba, Black Sheep, all of those things. What do they have to do with being Jamaican? But yet these are some of the first things that our children are taught to memorize. You know what I mean? And as a teacher, I know the purpose of memorization and developing that. But good Lord, man, we don't want to hear about Little Miss Muffet. Better to tell them about Little Miss Lou. You know what I mean? I don't want to hear about Jack B. Nimble. Tell me about Kodjo. I don't want to hear about Baba Black Sheep. I want to hear about the Rasta man. You know what I mean? I want to hear things that will let our children understand the depth of our history. Right? And our connection to Africa. Because the reason why this white supremacy prevails is because that everything we get is dressed up in their clothes, right? And And so subconsciously we are taught to want to look like them, to be like them, to glorify them. It's why I always tell the churches when I go there and they got up the white Jesus, I said, listen, I get some paint and paint those Jesus statues out for you for free.
But
And they,
and
some of them take offense.
we laugh though, but if we look at the tenets of what makes up the societies, the culture, we have the government, we have media that supports the government line typically, until we've had the democratization of media and we have social media and content creators. But the church is a very significant pillar in setting the norms of society. So it's not a small thing that the church will put a white Jesus in church. And
Yeah.
it's not a small thing. It's a huge thing because you're misrepresenting history, number one. And you're also co-signing a white supremacist messaging that all things that were good were white and black hasn't produced anything good. I'm simplifying it. But it's a very small thing. That's a huge thing in the mindset. So when you even
Yeah.
tell people, young children, that Jesus could not have been white because of where he was born and who he was born from, it would have been possible. And they struggle with that
Yeah.
because all of the images around them, including in their church, is that. So there are things that we need to fix. This is why, for me,
Yes.
the reparations is about repair, and repair is not just about an economic solution. It's really about a self-repair and a social repair within the societies, and saying we need to stop the trauma. Let's stop the trauma. The trauma of even
And
brutalizing your children as a means of punishment so that they will learn. And if we knew the history of why mothers would beat their children, they would beat their children to an inch of their life to stop the plantation owners from beating them to death. So they would say, no, you can't run away, let's beat. And that's been passed down and normalized, that we
mhm.
need beating. Our ancestors in certain parts of Africa didn't beat children because it was their ancestors. They believed that their children were their ancestors coming back. So this brutal way of punishing our young goes against who we are and our history. So
Yes.
there's a lot of, and this is why I focus on education. There's a lot of education that's needed. I don't really care where it comes from. It has social media, websites, self-learning. But we have to get more of the messages in, and the soon to be released nursery rhymes is vital for that, because we need to do that.
Yeah, it's very important, and I love how you dissect a lot of those social norms and the connection to history, because ignoring the history for so long has caused us to miss some of those connections and to perpetuate some of the things we should have tweaked and changed a long time ago. So I do agree with you on that. Your sons need a little militancy, though. I'm still putting this out there for black people. I've been seeing some videos going around, and boys being bullied. And as much as I join the chorus of, oh, bullying is a terrible thing, I think it's also important to teach our sons and our daughters, but particularly our sons, who may be confronted in a more physical manner, not to be afraid to defend themselves. You know what I mean? There's no reason that the children of Africans who had to overcome so much,
Mm-hmm.
right, should not be some of the fiercest people in the world today. So I am not for this pacifying our people, because we still need an element of militancy to overcome those last obstacles. And one of the biggest things that we must start to be overcome is the fear.
Is it?
Understand that chattel slavery operated greatly on the system of fear, right? Because 1-to-1, Europe would have lost a battle long time for hundreds of years that they held up the system. So the system was held up by the fear of, what happens if we do this, or what happens if we do that. And it's the reason why any successful African uprising, if you check the history, always involved an element of what we call obia, right? And it was no hocus pocus kind of angle. It was just that those were the tools that were necessary to convince Africans of their power. It was like a psychological adrenaline shot. So when the obia man would tell them that, listen, and I've rubbed you with this oil, no bullet can penetrate you. That's how you get an army of stones and stick carrying soldiers to face an army of bullet and musket wielding soldiers. You need that element. You know what I mean? And it was absolutely successful, again, in the case of Haiti, and certainly in the case of Chief Tachi. The law in Jamaica outlawing obeah was instituted after Tachi's revolution. I don't know how many Jamaicans know that, right? And the reason it was made a law is because they realized the role that obeah had played in what was almost a successful overthrow of the colonial government at the time. And to this day, it is still on the books. Meanwhile, we have all kind of East Indian astrologers here advertising on TV about it. But the obeah, man, is illegal, not because of obeah, but because of the role that he played some 300, almost 300 years ago in slave up, quote unquote, slave uprisings. You know what I mean? So it's one of the reasons we have brought up at the Reparation Council the need for that law to be walked back. Not that we're promoting obeah, but that we understand the reason it was made illegal had nothing to do with spirituality or religion. It had to do with subjugating Black people and removing from them anything that would cause them to fight against an unjust system, right?
And it was
But
reversing
you
that
do
fear,
make
because
some excellent.
you say that, Stephen, but that whole fear, it's amazing. It's actually blowing my mind, because when you think about us as a people, that difference between, one of the challenges I find living in the Caribbean is I've got some feedback. Is it gone now? I think it's gone now. Is the difference between service and servitude? Yeah, in trying to separate. Wow. So I'm getting feedback on this line. Can you hear it? Okay, Stephen.
Yeah, man, I'm hearing you okay.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to read some of them too myself as you said it.
Yeah. Is that difference, and is that fear that we still go? Because when I see that, we don't protest, where we accept substandard, we just accept whatever we're given. But the fear in saying, let me stand up and let me take a risk that I can get knocked down, the fear of criticism, the fear of putting forward, is all coming from that trauma, that legacy that's been normalized for generation to generation. And it turns up in our society today, where we are still afraid to stand up to authority. We are afraid to even tell the girl behind the counter that her service is substandard and she can't really talk to me like that. We just kind of sit there and accept it. So there's a lot of repair that needs to happen at every level of society to understand how we eliminate racism. Because part of eliminating that racism is standing up to it as well. Stand up to it and don't allow it.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, we were talking about white Jesus, and coincidentally, it's now a centenary since Garvey in 1924 paraded a life-size painting of the Black Jesus Christ in 1924 at a parade in Harlem, and the reaction from Black people at that time was incredulous. I mean, people were saying this is blasphemous. Not white people saying this, you know. Black people were saying this is blasphemous. Again, Jesus be black, blah, blah, blah. And to tell you the truth, we're the only race who have so readily accepted deifying others outside of our race who don't look like us. You know, the American Indians had American Indian looking gods. Europe made sure their gods, even if they didn't come from Europe, they were interpreted as Europeans, right? Indians, Shiva, Krishna, they don't look European. The Shintoism in Japan, they don't have European gods, right? But yet we went through such a diabolical social experiment that if you go to Ghana or other places in Africa now, just pay attention to the billboards on the street. I mean, I was flabbergasted when I was there a couple of years ago. I was like, I had to ask the driver, I'm like, yo, why so much white Jesus on the billboards? Does white Jesus live in Ghana? Right? In Africa. Yeah, Africa got some of the biggest Christian populations right now. I mean, when the Pope was sick the other day, remember they were talking about the next Pope might be African. I forget what the cardinal's name is, but there are quite a number of African bishops and priests, even in the Catholic Church, which is one of the strongest Christian denominations. But I'm just saying the fact that we've been taught so much, as Malcolm X said, who taught us, to hate ourselves from the top of our heads to the sole of our feet. And again, that is one of the consequences of that racial discrimination. If you discriminate against a particular race, not just for a decade, not just for a century, right, but for successive centuries, what do you think? What kind of children you're going to produce? Remember, we come from an era where it was thought to be better if you could marry outside your race because it would mean social improvement in your standing. Look at how many of our early black MPs married white women, because that was a way of upward social mobility, right? Where does the bleaching come from? Where does the saying that when we tell each other you're black like? Where do these things come from? It comes from that institutionalization of racism that causes us to internally hate what we represent, because none of the images they portray to us, none of the heroes that they give us look like us. And in fact, quite the opposite. Remember the Governor General's medallion? The only black man in the picture is representing the devil with a white angel stepping on his neck, the Order of St. Michael. And we had that for decades. It was just the other day, the woke mindset said, hey, look at this. Look at this medallion. What's on this medallion? But for decades before it was there. Successive governor generals wore it. Nobody said nothing about it, right? So there is a change happening. I must give credit for that. But you even read the Bible yourself. Remember when Herod issued that death contract on Christ? Remember when he was killing all the babies and Joseph and Mary had to flee out of Judea or wherever they were, Bethlehem, after they had the baby? They had to go to Africa. Where did they hide? They had to hide amongst black people. So how could Jesus be white? If he's a white man trying to hide, you go Africa, go hide, and everybody say, oh, the white boy, the one white boy in the village down there. Yeah, we know where he is. He's right over there. No, so we have to use those things to have our own interpretation of the Bible if we want to hold on to it. You know what I mean? Ethiopia has one of the oldest Bible, and they weren't suffering from white supremacy, I love Ethiopian iconography because of the black angels and their black interpretation of the saints. But even that in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church now is changing, because a lot of these images are being manufactured even from printers in China, who are changing them slowly from black iconography to white iconography. So that's happening. And don't forget, this issue of white supremacy and racism didn't just affect Africans. I mean, we were the direct guinea pigs. We were the people who were directly experimented on. But it spread out to bruise the rest of the world. You know what I mean? The yellow man, as Garvey would say, or the Asiatics, the red man. Everybody suffered, from white supremacy up until the point that they could get their wealth up, because this was an important tool in ending racism, and something I don't think we talk about a lot, right? As a nation, once you become wealthy, it don't seem to matter what your skin color is. You know what I mean? Because the green tops everything. And that is particularly true in the experience of the Chinese and the Japanese. And the reason why countries like Japan industrialized so quickly in response to the racism, the mechanism of racism that was prevalent in the world at the time. You know what I mean? Remember, the Japanese at the first League of Nations had a hard time taking their place at the table. It's the same conference that Marcus Garvey sent representatives to represent the interests of Africans, and they were told, you can't have a seat at the table because you don't represent any country. but yet they were having a meeting, calling it a League of Nations to deal with world affairs, and there was not one African invited to the table, as if we, who make up a third of the world's population or more, had no say in the matter. And all of that is because for 300 years before that, they had laws that said black people weren't human.
Right.
Don't invite them to our party. Don't invite them to the meeting. That's not protocol, you know? And that's why it's important for us to eliminate these things, because they are so entrenched. 300 years is a long time that we really have to dig through a lot of these laws and a lot of these social and corporate practices, industrial practices, to really uncover them and get rid of them. You know, I was in Suriname a few months ago, and speaking to an audience there, I had to remind them that there was a man from Suriname named Jan Matzliger. Again, not a name that is known, but he was a very famous in the shoe industry for being the man who revolutionized the shoe industry and made shoes to be able to be mass produced by machines. Now, here's another little bit of history. People don't know that up until the late 19th century, all shoes had to be hand sewn. They did not have a machine that could sew the shoes to the sole, right? Because, you know, you need a very strong stitching on that, or tutus, you take 3 steps, that's going to bust apart. So every shoe back before the 19th century had to be hand sewn. And that's why only rich people had shoes at one point. Because if you're producing a product like that, it takes that kind of time. It costs a lot of money. That's where we get the saying in Jamaica about Sunday best. For a long time, black people would only have one shoe, right? And they saw every day was not a shoe day for black people coming out of emancipation. We only put on the shoe when we were going to the house of the Lord on Sunday. And that's how the term Sunday best in Jamaica come. Put on your Sunday best. It was referring to the one shoe that it probably took you 5 years to save up to get that one shoe. God help you if your foot grow the next year after you save up for the 5 years, right? But Jan Matzliger was a Surinamese black man who patented the machine that was able to mass produce shoes. You know what they call him in the shoe industry? They called him the Dutch nigger. And he died a little after his patent. He never saw any wealth from it, right? But yet, it was so absolutely necessary to the shoe industry. I did a trace on the company, and you know, that company that he worked for, eventually coming over the years and decades and all over a century, eventually was incorporated or absorbed by, guess who? Black and Decker. And so when I went to Suriname, I told them, listen, you all need to explore a lawsuit, and I'm not even joking, against Black and Decker, because this man, without this man, we would not be wearing shoes, or it would have took us a while to figure out shoes. And think of how a shoe must be $1 billion industry. And here's a black man who was so essential to it, yet his family, his country, his nation, nobody connected to him is benefiting from it. Yet Black and Decker, Gamble and Procter, and all these other companies that were involved in those corporate companies that were attached to him have made so much money that their grandchildren don't even need to work. You know what I'm saying? And their grandchildren change their shoes 3-4 times a day. What you gonna say?
Yeah, and you make the point. I'm gonna stop talking because the feedback is there. So I just wanted to raise the point that the colonizers knows the truth. Remember Putin paraded out the Black Madonna during the recent war that he had with Ukraine to remind everybody else that we know the truth. That they have Black Madonna in there. They know the truth.
Yes. The Russians are Orthodox Christians, just like the Ethiopians and the Syrians. So a lot of their early iconography was black because they represented true depictions of the saints and the disciples that they portrayed. You know what I mean? Yeah, they were white men looking like white men living in that part of the world under summer. Remember, it didn't snow in Bethlehem and Egypt in them days there. I don't. It still don't snow in Israel.
That's really fair. Is it? Oh wow.
Yeah, it
Listen,
happen. People of color, the skin have to adapt. So yeah, but you can't blame Europe because, like I said, even if they don't have their own gods, if they take gods from other people, they put them in their image. So there's nothing wrong with Africans if we're going to accept Christianity. At least put it in our own image. That way, your children don't grow up with a complex, thinking that listen, your children should think that their gods look at least like their parents. At
okay,
least
so
like their parents.
the very first line in the very first book, the very first chapter in the very first book of the Bible, the Christian Bible that we read and not the Ethiopian Bible, is God made man in his image. So God told you
Yes.
that I made you in my image. So there's no African Christian that's not supposed to be worshipping a black Jesus
Yes.
and a black God.
Yes.
He made us in his
Yes.
image. And we were the
Yes.
first man
Even though the
he
truth,
made.
even though the truth of that is that man made God in his image, because that first line of the Bible wasn't written by God, it was written by Moses. And we know where Moses grew up. Moses grew up under an African mystery system. He was educated in a industrialized African civilization at the time, right? He was taught the mystery system by the African priests at the time. Don't sleep on Moses. Moses' problem though was that he was adopted and he could not sit on his brother's throne. So eventually him and his brother had to clash. And even after the clashing with his brother, even after him causing an uproar in his brother's kingdom, his brother never lifted a hand against him until Moses murdered his brother's son. Or I guess God did, if that's the way you want to believe the story. But it wasn't until Pharaoh lost his son that he raised his hand against Moses. Why? Because Moses was his older brother. Remember, Pharaoh's daughter adopted Moses before she could have a child herself, but she eventually had a child. So this child grew up with, no little brother does not look up to his big brother, especially if his big brother is a good big brother. And if my big brother coming to make war on me, I'm not hearing it, big bro. I'm not locking you up. I'm not arresting you. I'm not killing you. But if my big brother mess with my son, that's where we draw the line. You know what I mean? You can't mess with the kid. But anyway, we're going off on a side tangent. But I'm glad to drop that nugget because I want people to understand. Read and interpret the Bible for yourself. That's the problem with us as black people. I can understand under slavery if it was appealing, the Christian liturgy and the promise of a better life when you die, because these things will appeal to people who are being brutalized under a system of slavery. If you're telling me, it's just like the Muslims nowadays, you know what I'm saying? They will go to jihad because of the promise of the afterlife. Can you imagine an African enslaved who faces long hours every day, brutality, beatings, rapings, starved half to death? Of course, if you're going to tell him that when he dies, he's going to be in a palace in the sky drinking milk and honey, yeah, he'd love to hear that because he might be dead tomorrow. He might be dead any day of the week. So it becomes appealing to him. But I'm just saying, read and interpret for yourself. One of the things that the early Ethiopianists did, and they're the forerunners to Pan-Africanism, was to challenge the white supremacy interpretation of the Bible. And they were the ones who combed the Bible and started to point out what was said about Egypt, what was said about Ethiopia. A lot of the things the Rastafarians refer to today come out of the Ethiopianists, and the first Ethiopianists came out of Southern Africa. And they were black clergy in white churches who were not being promoted because of racial discrimination. And so they decided to read the Bible and give their own interpretation. And they saw where it said Solomon was black but comely. They saw where it said princes shall come out of Egypt. They saw where it said the Ethiopian cannot change his skin, neither the leopard his spot. And they began to use that interpretation of the Bible and of biblical lore to create what essentially became black power, or as the Rastaman used to put it, before the era of black power, it became our liturgy of black supremacy. This is how we countered 300 years of white supremacy, right? Don't ever forget that and don't be ashamed of it. One time we used to say them Rastaman are some cultists, them Rastaman so and so and so. But listen, the philosophy that they were coming with was so profound in terms of its ability to counteract the subliminal white supremacy that we would not even admit we were suffering under after 300 years of slavery. Government is supposed to be, and this controlled by the people, but I think that after our ancestors fought and shed so much blood, even for the right for us to vote and participate in government, after that we completely surrendered those rights and duties and obligations to the partisan system. And this has been one of my big criticisms of where partisan politics has taken Jamaica, not only Jamaica, but in other countries. I mean, one, we adopted a European political system, you know, the political culture of ours, the bicameral system, the Westminster model, blah, 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 which is fine. It's a great place to start. But each way along the way, we should have been tweaking our policies and tweaking our system of government to match the culture of our people. But in Jamaica, for too long, we always ignore the culture, or we downplay it, or we try to suppress it if it doesn't conform or mirror the European system. And that has been our problem for a long time. Jamaica created reggae music. We didn't accept it until the world accepted it and already began to exploit it. Jamaica's been smoking ganja for a long time, talking about the benefits of ganja. We didn't accept that. We didn't fight for it at the UN. But yet in every stadium, I remember going as a kid, as a child, you go to the stadium, you hear the man say, Peanut, Wrigley, Sense, Emilia. We know it's in our culture, right? But yet we waited for countries like Uruguay to legalize it and start. Uruguay don't have one ganja plant in Uruguay. The biggest medicinal industrialized ganja scientists and manufacturers nowadays is Israel. Israel. How come Jamaica's not in that game? And right now, we saw the headlines the other day about so much imported ganja in Jamaica. And I'm listen, for people who have a problem with ganja, I'm just giving this as an example in terms of an industry that our people from almost 100 years ago were pointing to and were trying to develop. Let's remember Pinnacle. Let's remember Leonard Howell. Let's remember these people. And if we had taken it seriously, look what Miss Lou did with our culture, taking it to the world. Now, if you go to Britain, our patois forms the basis of slang. But yet, when I was growing up, they were still talking about, why you chat bad? Talk better than that. You see what I'm saying? That white supremacy was always prevailing, and it has hindered us in terms of recognizing the real diamonds and gems that come out of the belly of our culture and our people, and embracing it and enhancing it and promoting it long before the world comes along and exploits it. You know what I mean? The man who signed Bob Marley to his big record deal and currently probably still has the rights to his music is the descendant of a famous Jewish slave trader who was known as the Typhoon, a slave master by the name of Lindo, who owned a plantation in what became Trench Pen years before Bob Marley was living there. Isn't it ironic that his descendant is the person who made the first millions of dollars out of reggae music? Huh? How come? But nobody knows this. Oh, Lord, man, I'm not calling no name, but check your history. The Lindo family was a prominent, they owned a wharf on Kingston where they brought in enslaved Africans, and they even owned the same trench town that we claim as the music mecca of Jamaica. And how ironic is it that they became the first people to commercialize reggae music and to build wealth out of it? Huh?
Yeah.
Without reggae music, you know, there wouldn't have been no South Beach, Miami. But let me stop talking. Let me not say too much.
Yeah.
And I hope everybody takes a moment on the pause and remember the ancestors, those who were victims of the transatlantic slave trade. Even though we should stop calling it that and call it what it was, the European trafficking and chattel enslavement of Africans. That's what it was. It's very, very important. Of course, March 25th, that date was chosen because on March 25th in 1807 was the day that those legislators in London ended the slave trade. So even behind these dates, there's history going back. We have the Sharpeville Massacre, March 21st, which became the day for the elimination of racial discrimination. And we have March 25th, the day of the abolition of the European slave trade by the British Parliament. That becomes the day of remembrance for the victims of the transatlantic slavery. So it's important, and please sign the petition. The Repair campaign has out there. We need all the support we can get. I would love to see Jamaica and the CARICOM countries, in fact, every country where Africans are in the diaspora and even on the continent, take a pause on this day. Really what we should be doing is laying roses down like we see the French president and the US president and the British prime minister do every year for their fallen soldiers in World War II. Black people have to understand that we fought a longer war than the world wars, and that our Holocaust was longer than the Holocaust, right? We are the Jesus race, yeah, the ones who suffered for humanity's sake. Before our treatment by the Europeans and before our agitation, there was no such thing as human rights. We invented it, and we got to claim it and uphold it.
But I think that's number one on the list. We need to mark the 25th as the day that we remember our fallen soldiers, and we have to mark the 25th. I mean, as a holiday, a day where we stop in Jamaica.
Yes.
Remember that. And the CARICOM, at the CARICOM level, I think we pushed up the CARICOM as a demand, though, because we really need to put more to mark our fallen, and they were fallen soldiers, because they fought for our freedom. So that's
yes.
that is a
Can never forget them. Men, women, and children. You know. Remember Mary Prince in Bermuda. Remember Sabina, who Sabina Park is named after. Black women who took their own lives and the lives of their children rather than live in slavery. It was these kind of statements that shook the system and brought it down.
Not there. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for this.
Thanks for having me, Sharon. Keep up the great work.
All right. Take care, everyone. All right.